Hello, you guys, Luxura Moon Goddess, and today we will be discussing Be Alone to Grow Spiritually. So, I can say from personal experience, because I've been alone pretty much most of my life anyway, being alone can help you grow spiritually, and I'm going to explain as to why that is. There's nothing wrong, first and foremost, with wanting to be alone, traveling alone on the personal self journey. Sometimes, and I think especially in today's time, most people do not know how to be alone. It's like we have people out here that who they literally don't like themselves enough to be able to be alone by themselves. So, being alone, sometimes in life you have to be alone, and especially when it comes to spiritual growth, you need to be alone. And as to why that is, when you are alone, it allows you to really be more insightful and reflective on yourself, on your life experiences, da 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 da. Because, and this is the reason why. Because you're alone, you're going to have, obviously, more time to yourself. And usually, the best thing to do is to use that time to stop and think. Really think about your life experiences. Really think about the things that you've gone through, not just spiritually, but just in general. What have you gone through in life? How have your experiences shaped who you are? What have you learned from your experiences? See, when you're thinking along the lines of that thinking track with those types of questions, this is what's going to help you to grow spiritually because you're reflecting on your life. You're accessing your memories and learning from the experiences that you've gone through, which that's the best way. If you want to really learn and really want to improve, that is the best thing for you to do. Use, especially if you have negative experiences, negative memories, see those experiences as learning opportunities. Okay, this happened at the time, but if it were to happen again, or if I'm in that situation again, here's what I'm going to do the next time, or here's what I've learned from that negative experience. So, being alone, I say, is very important for spiritual growth. A lot of people, when it comes to spirituality and also religion, they like to, especially when they're, like, let's say, looking for a romantic partner or what have you, they also want, someone else in that journey, which is okay. It's kind of like also where religious people go to church to be around people with a similar belief, similar religion, which that can be, fine in itself. But honestly, to me, you will grow much more faster and be able to receive much more spiritual knowledge when you are alone. And again, there's nothing wrong with being alone. People tend to think that when you're alone or you're by yourself, that you're, oh, she must be lonely, a lonely person. She doesn't have any friends, da 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 da. It's like, no. No, don't see it in that light. Don't see it in a negative perspective. Because when you're alone, and there's going to be periods in your life where you're going to be alone. Trust me, it's going to happen at some point. And you're going to have to really be strong in yourself. You're going to really be rooted more in your spirituality because, again, you're alone. It's giving you time to think, to reflect, to really be able to receive spiritual, especially when it comes to receiving spiritual knowledge, especially if you're someone who works with spirits, communicates with spirits, frequencies, and different entities. You're going to actually be able to hear and receive that knowledge from them much more easier because you are alone. You're much more receptive, especially to other entities, to other spiritual beings, because you're alone. it allows you, it's something with the mental component of being alone that really is transformative, if I say so myself. hmm Now, it's not to say that you have to be alone forever or for the rest of your life. I do tend to think, as a whole, with many spiritual people, they tend to be more on their own, more solitary by nature. Not that they don't have any friends. With me, I'm not really, and I'm gonna make a video on this at some point. I'm not really into friendships in my adulthood. It's just something where, to me, and just to talk about it a little bit briefly, to me, friendships in adulthood really doesn't hit the same way as when you're a child. But I've always been more of a solitary person anyway. I've always, want to be solitary, be on my own, kind of do my own thing anyway. And I think a part of that, especially when I started to, because a few years prior, I went into my very first spiritual awakening. I think honestly, being alone enabled me to go through that spiritual awakening because I was on my own. I was doing things, I was also journaling my own thoughts, focusing what's going on through my own mental. And something about that period of my life being on my own, not really engaging too much with other people, it was just kind of like the perfect time for that spiritual awakening because it was my early adulthood, and this was around 2020 when it happened. And so it really allowed me to grow and transform very rapidly because, again, I was just into that mental state of mind. It had kind of had to do with my mental state of mind. And I was much more in tune because I had the time to really be thinking a lot, to really reflect, to kind of ponder things, to question things about society, things in life. My life experiences so far, even though I was still very young, being able to think in that manner, and especially again with the power of journaling, allowed me to grow and have that spiritual awakening. And as I continued, especially again, if you want to grow spiritually, a good hobby you should have, because, and again, you're going to be kind of primarily alone most of the time. Most of the time, journaling is a really good habit to get into if you want to be more spiritual or if you want to grow spiritually. And with that being said, I have many journals. I have, like I said, I started really getting into journaling around 2020. And oh my goodness, I have so many journals. I have so many journals. I have spiritual journals. I have journals about a journal about relationships. I have a manifestation journal. I just really love journaling. It allows me to put out my thoughts. It allows me to grow. It's so much more mentally and spiritually. So, if you really want to grow a lot spiritually, get into the habit of journaling, get into the habit of writing, because that's going to really help you transform your mental and grow more spiritually because again, you're questioning, you're trying to really reflect. When you're reflecting on your life experiences, especially, when you reflect on things, you may not reflect on it, right after it happened, but especially when you're reflecting on it years later when you're a little bit older, you realize, because you matured, you have a different perspective on that situation, that experience, and this allows you, especially if you're learning really quickly and you're growing more mature, you're going to grow and become more spiritual. You're going to receive information and you're going to know how to do better if that situation arises again. hmm So, with that being said, I like to spend, especially when I like being solitary. You can also do more, again, other activities since I'm talking about journaling. Being out, especially in nature, like you can take a journal out in nature or be alone, going on walks. Especially, I think being out in nature really can clear out your mind, which is also really good for spiritual transformation and spiritual growth. Because, especially with, the way life is, you go through stress, through different, problems, different things arises. It's especially important to be able to release that stress, to really clear out your mind, to get your mental clarity. And, going out for walks, being in nature, alone, even if you don't walk or exercise, even if you're just like sitting at a park in a bench, just enjoying the scenery or enjoying the nature, even that is really beneficial. And I found, especially with that, because again, my mental is in like a different state. It also, it raises my frequency to be outside in nature. Plus, again, you're sitting alone, you're kind of pondering, you're thinking, really thinking and getting into the habit of thinking, not just like, and when I'm saying thinking, again, not just like random thoughts or like stressful things or, not nonsensical things. You want to be really reflecting because you want to reflect. You want to learn through your experiences and the different things that you've gone through. So when you get into the habit of, thinking in a certain way, it's going to allow you to grow more spiritually because again, you know how to think. And a part of thinking, sometimes when you get older or you have to kind of change the way you think because especially now that I'm saying that, the way that I think now is not how I used to think, when I was younger or when I was a teenager or, when I was a child. And honestly, I can say that that is a really good thing because if I were still thinking the way I used to think, even in my early adulthood or in my teenage years, because I'm not that old, I can't say I can't really say that I would have learned the things that I know now or even had a spiritual awakening because the way that I think now is so much more beneficial. It's so much more beneficial. It's like I don't get super emotional over like, the most nonsensical things anymore. I'm not as angry or as bitter or as resentful as I was, in my early 20s because I've changed the way that I think and I can do a video on that. I think it's important that I put that information out there because it really is about, the way that you think. So, with that being said, the way that you really kind of think can affect how much spiritual growth that you can experience. Now, how much can you grow spiritually? When is it enough? Is there a plateau to spiritual growth? I feel like, honestly, you can grow as much spiritually as you'd like. There may be periods where you may kind of go into lulls, so to say, because you one moment, especially, some people have, their first spiritual awakening, then they're receiving lots of knowledge, they're growing spiritually, they're gaining lots of insight, and then all of a sudden you kind of experience like a slow period. You may not feel as, not that you don't feel as spiritual anymore, but sometimes, you may experience, like a low, a slowdown, which I think that's kind of expected. And then who knows, you can go through another spike, another spiritual awakening. You could be receiving different knowledge. It just kind of, everybody's spiritual journey is going to look kind of different. I can say I'm still receiving a lot of spiritual knowledge and growing spiritually, but not as rapidly as I was before. Just because, kind of within the past couple of years, I've honestly received a lot of spiritual information. But, I think it's just kind of expected. And so, but who knows, I may, again, change my mindset some more, change the way that I think, communicate to spirits more, because being spiritual is very important to me, and I always want to remain spiritual because I know that there's more personal benefit to me, and especially with my mental wellness, if I remain a spiritual person. hmm So, with that being said, do not be afraid to be alone in your spiritual journey, being in solitude, because really it is kind of needed to be, in solitude, to be alone. It's not really something to be scared of. It's not something for people to feel sad about. It's just kind of, if you really do want to grow spiritually, you do need to be alone. And you're not gonna, once you kind of get used to being alone, because some people, again, they're just not used to being alone. They always want to be around people. They want to socialize. They want to be around people. They want to share all of their information with other people. Da 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 da. But once you're kind of alone and you get used to it, it's not really going to be much of a problem to you, because you'll get used to it, and then you're going to realize, oh, I really enjoy this, or oh, I really am becoming more reflective, more transformative. I'm growing spiritually. I'm receiving all this knowledge that, I may have not received before, because I'm spending more time alone, because I'm becoming more reflective, because I'm thinking about all of these different things. So, anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to share with you guys, for today. Don't be afraid to be alone, because, again, being alone is really needed if you want to experience, true spiritual growth. So, that's all I have for this one, and I will check you later. Bye.